So 1 week ago, Australia, along with the US, asked for an independent team of researchers to go to Wuhan to find out where the virus really originated from. A reasonable request to most people, but it sure made China mad. And now the Chinese are expected to put a tariff on all barley trade coming to them from Australia. And of course, China says it's not related at all. So is it or isn't it? Let's look into that in today's video. Alright, so we're just gonna read one section from this article since it's very important to the rest of the story. It reads from here. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison has sought support for an international investigation into the coronavirus pandemic in phone calls with the US President Donald Trump and the German and French leaders overnight, the government said on Wednesday. You see, it wasn't only Australia asking for this, the US has joined in also, while France and Germany have been more hesitant. So the reason I'm showing you this section of this article is to point out that the two nations asking for an independent investigation are the two nations now suffering potential trade disputes with China, while France is not. So keep that in mind as we are reading this article from the Sidney Morning Herald. It reads, a shot at the hull, Scott Morrison plays down China barley dispute. Prime Minister Scott Morrison does not believe a sudden escalation in a $600 million trade dispute with China is part of a coordinated campaign from Beijing aimed at squeezing local producers in retaliation for his push for a global inquiry into the coronavirus. China is expected to level tariffs on Australian barley producers as it pursues an anti-dumping investigation into Australian dumping of the grain largely used for Chinese animal feeding and beer production. Okay, so the Chinese are pretending that this is all about Australia producing too much barley and then dumping it into China. But when you look into it, Australia hasn't produced more than they've done in the previous years, so this comes at an interesting time. Okay, let's continue. The tariffs of up to 80% would effectively end barley trade between the two countries and hit farmers in Western Australia, where the majority of Australian exporters are based. More than half of all Australia's annual barley exports go to China. There are two interpretations within the Australian government on China's actions. The first is Beijing is sending a message as retaliation for Australia's advocacy of a coronavirus inquiry by targeting a relatively low-risk export. That sounds about right. The second is China pursuing the process that began 18 months ago because of its grievances with Australia's anti-dumping measures against its own products, including steel. That sounds very unlikely. The timing of the barley dispute has raised the prospect that it is the first stage in an economic coercion campaign that could target Australian universities and other agricultural exports as relations between Australia and its largest trading partner deteriorate. It's really frustrating because this follows a pattern of how China is using their influence to get their way with otherwise really good trading partners. Let's read on in the last sections here in the article. Trade Minister Simon Birmingham had a crisis meeting with producers on Monday morning and is now working through the documents with the Department of Trade to finalize Australia's response by the deadline of May 19 in just 6 days. Asked on Monday if he believed the barley dispute was tied to the coronavirus inquiry, Mr. Morrison said no, and said he hoped it would be determined on its merits. It's an anti-dumping issue. They certainly haven't raised it as connected to other issues, he said. I would be extremely disappointed if it was. Jeffrey Wilson, the research director at the Perth US Asia Center, said the allegations of Australian farmers dumping cheap barley in China and crowding out local producers were unsubstantiated. It is absolutely scandalous, he said. The case is without merit. So Wilson's on to something here. Dr. Wilson said the process had been going on for 18 months and that trade observers had expected the dispute to be resolved without further investigation. Given it is without merit legally and hot on the heels of retribution threatened by China's ambassador, any other explanation other than it being politically motivated would be disingenuous. You see, this comes right after the Chinese ambassador to Australia, this guy, Cheng Yinjie. Yeah, I'm not gonna get it right. Well, that guy, he said this.
Maybe the ordinary people will see, why should we drink Australian wine, eat Australian beef?
So you can see why it's difficult to consider this a coincidence. So the problem here is, as this article says, that China has alternatives. The Australian people are the ones who are going to be worse off if this ban on barley takes place. So many Aussies on farms are dependent on these trade deals, and China knows all about it. China are experts at knowing their strengths and their partners' weaknesses, and they won't hesitate to use their weaknesses to get what they want. In this case, the Australian government has reasonable fears that this is just the first step unless they give in and stop asking for this independent team to go to Wuhan and find out what really happened in the beginning. So, in the end, I do think it's a disgraceful tactic, but you have to understand that China is running a long-term plan and they won't let anything get in the way of it. And I'm not going to be one of these people who pretend the main focus of the long-term plan of China is the South China Sea, but it's certainly part of it. So in the interest of keeping this video short, I won't go too much into it, but I will leave a link up here to a video I made just a few days ago about the South China Sea and how Australia and China both have military presence there right now. I will keep you guys up to date about future developments about the story, so remember to hit the subscribe button in the corner of this video or at the end screen of the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.